Number one lesson you need to learn before you can be effective at anything. No one and no thing can make you feel any feelings. Now, let me clarify, this is not going to be a suck it up buttercup type video, although that saying does have its time and its place. I'm going to explain to you why this is true, why it's so important to me, why it should be so important to you, but also I'm going to explain to you how you can do it better, how you can manage your emotions better. It starts with self-awareness, leads to self-regulation, and ultimately that practice will lead to better success, regardless of the stress, pressure, or adversity that you face. Regardless of what you're facing, your ability to regulate your emotions is going to determine your ability to be effective. That is a fact. So let me explain what I mean by that. You feel something, right? Fill in the blank. I feel angry, happy, sad, mad, anxious, depressed, right? There's a difference between clinical anxiety and clinical depression, and what I'm talking about, feeling anxious and feeling depressed, sad. Okay, so let's clarify that. I'm not telling you should go to counseling. Counseling is important. Crushing anxiety, awful depression, go talk to a counselor. I'm talking about being sad, being anxious, as in nervous. You feel something and it affects your ability to perform well. Or, similar, this is why it's important to understand it, some people will force trying to be happy when in fact they are depressed and they should speak to a counselor. Or, say, like I experienced, a death in the family, and people are trying to force themselves to be happy. Why? There's a death in the family. Allow yourself time to grieve and be sad. That's the important. So we're in this world of either hide your feelings, forget your feelings, or let's be positive. Positivity, let's chase happy emotion and joyful emotion. And it's not how the brain works. So you have to understand the brain's response and what you are trying to accomplish. I was just having this conversation with some colleagues at work. I hosted a giving and receiving effective feedback workshop for a medical care center and their employees, which ranged from mid-60s experienced ladies down to some mid-20s just up and coming talent. And they were having some conflict in their communication. Well, the seminar that we had was mostly about how you present yourself and understanding your assumptions, your bias, and how it leads to unhealthy, unproductive emotions for the conversation you're trying to have. If I come into the conversation defensive, the conversation may not go very well from the start because I'm already defensive. So it's my responsibility to present myself well. But if I don't understand that I'm having these thoughts in my head that are leading to me being defensive, I'm going to walk in there thinking that I'm justified. And therefore my emotions and how I feel is going to feel justified, and then everything that I'm doing leading up to that is going to be justified. And I'm not saying you can't have effective conversations. I'm saying that you're starting from a deficit from the beginning. So understanding that emotions are the result. They are the result of how you think. Your thoughts are the result of how you believe about the world. Usually should and should not statements reflect your beliefs. This is the way the world should work. This is the world, or the world should not be this way, right? That's a pretty good indicator that you're talking about belief systems. So it's important that you understand this chain of events. Beliefs lead to your thoughts. Thoughts lead to your emotions. And that's even more important because every emotion is tied to a physical response. The stronger the emotional response, the stronger the physical response. And so that you may not feel the tie between emotions and physical because it might be minor, or maybe it's good and you feel good and you don't really recognize that. But every emotion is tied to a physical response. So think about that chain of events. I feel justified, my belief system. I didn't do anything wrong. Why am I being talked to by my supervisor? You walk in, so that belief system, those thoughts, and then you come in tense, with a heart rate and this scowl on your face, and you're defensive. From the beginning, that is a difficult conversation, because even if the supervisor is doing everything they can to be neutral and to be supportive and productive, you're coming into that at a deficit, at a disadvantage. You're causing a disadvantage for your supervisor. Now you take the opposite, or not the opposite, but a more productive way to look at this is, my supervisor wants to talk to me. I want to see what she has to say, and we'll have a conversation about it. It just feels different, right? And you're more likely to go into that conversation less stressed, less emotionally reactive, less physically reactive, more open to conversation. Consider creativity of, hey, maybe there is something that I can learn from this conversation. It changes the entire conversation. But and maybe even if my boss comes to me and, she's a little chirpy, well, you screwed this up and you need to stop doing that. Can I still manage my emotions, take lessons from that? Because maybe she's right. So rather than get defensive, my responsibility is to take it as an opportunity to learn and do something different and better. And I've been in those situations with really, really difficult supervisors, and I just felt like, man, this person hates me. And I'm talking over the course of years that I worked with this person. And so I understand how difficult that it can be. But it is still, regardless of your environment, regardless of the stress, pressure, and adversity that you face, it is still your responsibility. Nobody else is responsible. Your responsibility to regulate your emotions. So I've already gave you the chain of events, but there's a little bit more that I need you to understand. It's not just as simple as, I believe this and I think this and I'm going to feel this. Because there's a lot of things that are going on below the surface. And I'm not going to get into too much detail because I could talk about this for a long time, and I have. I used to teach this in college. I used to teach sports psychology, undergrad sports psychology. When the brain activates subconsciously, you may not even realize that all this stuff has already happened, which is why sometimes we call it an emotional trigger response. And as much as people want to dislike that term, you have to accept it as a biological human reality. Human reality. You have emotional triggers. Say it. Say it with me. I have emotional triggers. You have to acknowledge. Because until you acknowledge, it's like, going through Alcoholics Anonymous, which I've never been through. I'm not going to discount those that have. Good for you. But one of the first steps, actually I think it is the first step, that you have to acknowledge you have a problem. Otherwise, you're never going to be able to do anything about it. You have to acknowledge that you have emotional triggers before you're going to be able to do something about them. Now, it's up to you to identify what those things are. For me, for a long time, it's been anger. And what things triggered me? A lot of things. A lot of things triggered my anger. It was usually actually a frustration that led to anger, which is important because I believe anger is a secondary emotion, that it's usually led to by something else. For me, it was frustration. If I couldn't figure something out, I would blow my mind. I would get frustrated, and I would go from 0 to 3 to 400. Right? I would, oh my gosh, I'm so frustrated. Oh my gosh, I'm so frustrated. Oh my God, I'm so angry. That's how I responded because I didn't understand what was happening. And I wanted to take accountability. I didn't like losing my cool. I didn't understand it. And it showed up in my relationships. It showed up at work. It showed up in my friendships. It showed up in my recreational activities or learning. And that's where learning became difficult for me because I just became so frustrated. I wasn't able to go through the process of allowing myself to struggle and fail and struggle and fail and then learn. I got so frustrated because I just couldn't figure it out. It was a barrier for me. And it took me a long time to realize this is something that is my responsibility. There's something I have to be able to do about it. And it's that deep in the brain processing, that survival mechanism, the fight, flight, freeze response. And it happens so fast. How fast? Well, let's talk about this in context. So I was reading research article, and what I took from it was it takes you 1/25th of a second, or excuse me, 1/10 of a second to recognize that I just put up 4 fingers. 1/10 of a second to recognize that I now put up 3 fingers. Okay, that's pretty fast. However, the amygdala response, the emotional trigger response, that fight, flight, freeze response can happen in 1/25th of a second. Now, I haven't taken a math class in a while, and fractions are sometimes confusing, but 1/25th is 2.5 times faster than 1/10. So before you can even recognize that I've just put up 2 fingers, right, you already experienced a emotional trigger response 2.5 times faster than that. That's how important it is to understand what is an emotional trigger response. It's a natural human biological response. And a lot of times it has to do with your belief system and your thoughts. Well, your belief system and your thoughts are also habits. You have habit patterns, you have thought patterns, you have belief systems inside of your brain that are determining what your emotional trigger responses are, or at least how strong they are. So anytime you feel fear, anytime you feel anger, it's because of this trigger response, and you have to be able to recognize it, proactively work to de-escalate it, and then over time you're going to get better at that. But the more you allow your emotional trigger response to take over, that's the habit that you're building. You get better at what you repeatedly do, and the brain is never sitting still. So you are either producing good habits, reprogramming bad habits, or reinforcing bad habits. There is no neutral with the human brain. So everything that you do, your brain is paying attention to. So therefore, you have to make sure that your habits are productive and healthy. Otherwise, your habits are unproductive and unhealthy. There's no neutral. So you have to figure out, first of all, what is it that I typically experience? Where am I challenged? What are the emotional trigger responses? What are the emotions? What does it physically feel like? Because remember, every emotion is tied to a physical response. So how do I recognize the trigger? What is the emotion that I feel? What is the physical response that I feel? It is that kind of depth that you need to understand and acknowledge and own before you're ever going to be able to move on and do anything more productive. Once you understand that, then you can start implementing some mental skills to de-escalate that trigger response so you can think. And so here's the last part of research that I'm going to throw out there. The same research that recognized the emotional trigger response can fire in 1/25th of a second. They also recognized that when you have that emotional trigger response, the certain part of your brain that's responsible for logic and reason loses its ability to function, because when the amygdala fires, the area responsible for your emotional trigger and fight or flight, it needs glucose. So it pulls the glucose from your logic and reason area. So you see the problem here. So if you've ever had this issue where, man, I was so angry I just couldn't think straight, that is biologically what's happening to your brain. And you have to recognize that. Because once you recognize that, then you can understand, oh wow, an emotional trigger doesn't mean I'm weak. An emotional trigger means that I'm experiencing some type of threat. My brain is recognizing a threat. But the threat doesn't have to be a real threat. In fact, most of the time it's not. The threat response could be, hey, I'm getting ready to go speak in front of a class. I'm getting ready to go do public speaking, which scares a lot of people. And that is recognized by your brain as a threat. Why? Because you don't want to look silly. You're fearing judgment, right? You're fearing standing in front of your peers and looking like you don't know what you're talking about. The brain has one fear response, one trigger response. The only question is how strong. So when you experience fear for going up and before going up and doing some public speaking, the fear response is the exact same as if you were facing a bear in the woods. That is the importance of the emotional trigger response, and understanding that when I am scared to go do public speaking, oh, I'm emotionally triggered. I need to recognize my emotion. I feel nervous. Okay, I feel nervous. You identify it, then you own it, and then you act. I-O and A, Iowa. It's Iowa method. Identify your emotion, own it, Be okay with it. Non-judgmental, present moment focus. That's what we call mindfulness. Identify your emotion. I feel nervous. Own it. Yep, I feel nervous. No judgment. You're not weak. And then you act. Breathing techniques, progressive muscle relaxation, mindfulness, meditation, self-talk mantras, all the things that you can do to focus your attention, bring your energy down, bring your emotions down, de-escalate the trigger response, and then you're able to think effectively. Okay, what am I trying to do? What's the outcome that I desire, and what are the steps necessary to get there? The more you can do that, the more you're going to train your belief system and your subconscious thoughts, so that when you experience some type of fear response, it's not going to be as strong, and your emotions aren't going to feel as strong. Therefore, you're not going to have as strong of a physical response, and you're actually going to be able to achieve what you want to achieve, rather than locking up or getting angry or responding in a way that later on you're going to say, wow, that was completely unproductive, but I couldn't think straight. Your emotions are your responsibility.